Hi everyone. So in this video, we will see that the Spring Boot with our JP and H2 database integration. So we'll create four endpoints, that is create, retrieve, update, and delete. So based on that, we are exposing four endpoints. So H2 is nothing but an in-memory database. So whenever your application is running, so as far as your application will run, this H2 database will exist. You can also store it in your local drive as well. But for our example, we'll show you that how we can create our four endpoints, which will connect our H2 database, persist some objects, and then it will retrieve those objects as well as updating and deleting those operations. So let's get started. Yeah. Okay. So here I can see that I have already created one project that is based on your Spring Boot H2 database. So what are the dependencies we will actually require in this project? Okay, so that I can show you. So suppose the same process, if you want to create that project from the scratch, that from this is considered as a Spring Starter project. So inside that Spring Starter project, so these are the dependencies we just need to require here. So I will explain each one of the importance of this dependency. So the Spring Web is nothing but that is required for your MVC and for the embedded Tomcat. The Spring Data JPA is nothing but it will support the JPA support. This basically used for our JPA repository. This H2 database is our in-memory database which is required this H2 and whose scope will be runtime. The Spring Boot DevTools is nothing but if you make some changes to your application. So if in order to basically publish that without restricting your application, for that purpose we are using Spring Boot DevTools. The last one is the Lombok. So why we require Lombok? So for example, suppose if you write some sort of DTO class, POJO class, or any entity class, and inside that class we need to write for each of the attribute getter, setter, then we need to write for argument for constructor with no argument as well as argument. So this kind of boilerplate code can be reduced, can be removed by this Lombok concept, which will provide you some sort of annotation through which you just need to write those annotation, and it will register all those methods inside your class. Okay, so the same thing I just need to explain here. Just I just show you that inside our pom.xml file we have all those dependencies is present. So this is my JPA, this is my web, this is my DevTools, H2, Lombok, and each and everything I just mentioned here. Whatever I have just mentioned, those are coming properly. So now based on that, I just created a couple of packages. One is for, so as you can see that each packages will have its own significance. So the first one is the controller layer. The second one is the entity. The third one is the repo. The fourth one is the service. So let's go from that entity class starting there. So let's consider this is my employee class. So this employee class will act as an entity object. So as you know that in Hibernate we are follow the ORM concept that is called that object relationship mapping. So my Java object will basically map with our database object here. So here I just mentioned that okay, this is my employee object, and this employee object I just denoted as entity. Okay, so this is my entity object, and what is the table name? So if you don't mention any kind of table name, it will take this particular Java class name itself, and based on that it will create your employee class. So if the table is already exist, just like we will show you in MySQL integration, we will create the table first in our database, and based on that we will try to fetch. So if that table is already there in our MySQL database, so in that case you just need to mention that table name itself, because the database table, suppose the table which is present in your database is employee underscore db, so you need to mention that table name as employee underscore db, not only employee. So that table name is nothing but you have mapped your database table name with your Java object. Okay, at the data is nothing but it's a Lombok notation. So Lombok annotation is basically this will helps you to give all those getter setter things, so you don't need to write getter setter separately for each of the attribute. No argument constructor is basically nothing but the constructor without arguments, and the last one is the all argument constructor is nothing but that constructor with all the arguments. So in this way we just defined our entity class. So next, if I just go to our JP repository, so this is my employee repository. So here I can see that it will extend my JPA repository. This JPA repository will take two parameter. One is that for which class we are defining that. So that means the entity class we need to mention here. So this is nothing but employee, and the type of that, what is my primary key of our employee class. So that is long. So here you can see that this id I just mentioned it as a id value, and generated value is nothing but that will generate automatically those value. Correct? Okay, so that's also we just define the repository done. Then I just go to my service layer. So this service layer is present in h2.service. So here I just need to annotate my service layer with @service because it will act as a component as well. And also we just need to mention @transactional. So it is best practice to mention that @transactional in service layer, whether you can mention in service layer as well as in the method layer, but it should be defined in service layer. Why? Because suppose if any method will contains multiple transactions, suppose it will fetch some data from database, updating some data, and then based on that it will saving those information. So there are three types of transaction is there, and suppose in any case the transaction is basically failed, so what will happen, it will revert back, it will roll back to its initial stage, and that will basically resolve the problem of inconsistent of data. So that's why it's a good practice to mention this transactional annotation in your employee service, in your service layer. So here I can see that I have auto add my employee repository. So this is nothing but we just auto add this thing, and I have created a couple of methods. So the first one is that create employee. So this create employee is nothing but going to save my employee object. So this employee repo dot save, that method is coming from your JP repository itself. So if I just control space and if I can see it, so this is coming from your Crud repository. So Crud repository is nothing but the reference that will take from JPA repository. So now the next thing is that it will fetching all those lists, all those employee lists from our database. So for that we just using this find all method. So this is the inbuilt method. Based on that I just fetching all those information. Then I have this get employee by ID. So here I can see that I just find by ID based on this ID value. So this is nothing but gives you an optional object. So if the value is not null, if there is an existing of this employee, then it will return that employee object. And if it is not, I just create by my own employee which do not have any kind of information. So it's a blank object. Suppose in order to capture or in order to process in case of any kind of null pointer will happens. So here you can also mention if you want to throw some exception from here also, you can also throw some exception that you can mention or else throw. You can throw some null pointer exception, not found exception, object not found exception, any kind of things. Okay, so two differences that there is one other method that is called get by id, and one is find by id. So in case of find by id, so there is a two differences that, so in case of find by id, so get by id is nothing but if that is not there, then it will throw that entity not found exception. And if it is find by id, so if it is find by id, so it will, so here I can see that if it is null, then it basically gives you some blank object there. Okay, and it will throws that illegal argument exception if your id is null. Correct? So there is two difference. One is called the find by id and it is called get by id. Both you can use, but in case of find by id, it will gives you the optional object. So this optional object can be null, and if it is not null, then you can I just return back that actual object, and if it is null, then I just creating one employee object. Okay, so the next one is the delete by ID. So where we just mentioned that what is my ID, and based on that it will basically delete by ID. So all these methods are by default providing by your JPI repository. And the last one is the update employee. So this update employee and the insert employees, both we can handle in a single function, but here for simplicity I just create one more endpoint that is called update employee. So based on that, what will happen, it will just delete whatever the information is there in our database on that particular employee, and once that is deleted, then we are just going to insert this new information in our database. So there are two types of update operations we will perform. So one is called put mapping, one is called patch. So what will happen is, suppose in your employee object there are a couple of fields, for an example ID, name, and then you have that designation, salary, whatever, department. Now suppose there are 3-4 fields are fixed, and whenever in an update operation will happen, it will not happen in the entire process, in the entire entity. It will happen for some sort of some 1 or 2 fields. So in that case we just using patch mapping, and if it is happening for entire entity, then in that case we'll applying that for the put mapping. Okay, so now what will happen, so these are the 4 endpoints we just defined correctly here. So now I just go to my controller layer. So here, this is my controller layer, which is annotated with the @REST controller and @request mapping. And there I just mentioned what is my request mapping /API/employee. And there I just mentioned all the endpoints. That is, first one is my create employee. So that is nothing but my post mapping. The second one is basically get all employees. That is nothing but my get mapping. The third one is get employee by ID, where I just need to pass one path variable. So this is my path variable only, and based on that I just need to fetch all those response entity, all those response from my employee. So the next one is nothing but the delete. We will delete that employee object based on that ID. So that ID will also send with that path variable. And the last but not the least, that is my update one. So this update one is nothing but we are going to update our employee, and I just making as a @put mapping. So this is all about my controller layers. Now if I just go to my application.properties file, so here I just need to mention what is the different types of properties. Here I can also write that spring.h2.console.enabled, so that it will basically show you some sort of information, and as well as APA show SQL true, means whatever the SQL we are just performing, that will also show here. Correct? Okay, so now if I just start my running my application, so let's get tested this application. So we have 4 endpoints defined. The entire code base I will upload in the GitHub, and I will share that GitHub. So from there you will definitely get that code and implement your own employee Spring Boot applications. So okay, so let me open my Postman. Yeah, I already tested a couple of things here. So this is my employee first endpoints, where I just want to save some of the information. So for an example, suppose I have this Kalyan Ghosh department analytics, and my salary is 45,000. So if I just send it, I can see that this is creating with this ID1, because this ID is automatically generated from 1, and I can see the status is 201. Okay, let's try to create another employee. Suppose I make it cloud DevOps, and yeah, so I'm just trying to hit, yeah, so this is also created. So my creation endpoints is working fine, correct? And if you see that, if you see the console, I can see that this insert statement in the employee object is correctly done. So it will create one next value from Hibernate sequence, and based on that it will saving that information in my H2 database. Okay, so then the next thing is that I can fetch it out all those employee from here. So this is nothing but localhost 8080/API/employee, correct? So if I just run it, I just getting all the list of my employees, correct? Yeah, so here you can see that. Okay, it's somehow I just stuck here. Okay, so if I just check from here, these two things is basically coming successfully. Now suppose I want to fetch this information based on some ID. So /1. So based on ID 1, I just need to fetch this information. So it will fetch only the ID 1 that is there. Okay, so now the next endpoint, suppose I want to update some of the information. Okay, so localhost 8080 API/employee, and here I just need to mention what is my, that is called put mapping. So the body will be, suppose I want to change some information for Shande. So what will happen, so its ID is also, I just ascending, so this is ID is 1, correct? So I just want to make it from 65,000 to 75,000, and if I just send it, yeah, so now it will create with a new ID value, ID 3, and the department is cloud DevOps and name is Shande and salary is 75,000. So if you now search with some based on some name, so if you want to get the particular attribute or list of that entire things, so then in that case you will get that Shande is that his salary is basically updated with that 75,000 value, correct? Okay, so but this is not a correct way, because here we just change the ID value. So what will happen in case of put mapping, the entire ID value is now removed, and now it will create one more new entry for this Shande with this updated value. Okay, but in couple of later or in the next lecture when we integrate that MySQL thing, so instead of changing that ID value, how we can update the salary value, that I will explain correctly. Okay, so now there is one more things I just mentioned here. So here I just find that with this particular Shande or department or salary, so based on that name also I can fetch that information from my database. Okay, so the next one is that based on that delete operation. So the last one, if I just want to, yeah, so I just make it as a delete mapping. Okay, so there is no element for one. So if I just want to delete that shan, so if I just send it, so here I can see that this method not allowed. Why? Okay, let me check what is the delete mapping method I just mentioned here. Employee controller. Okay, so delete mapping. Okay, I just make a small mistake. It should be like that only. Yeah, so let me try to rebuild. So here I can see that it will change and it will publish automatically because of this tape tool. So now if I just run it again, internal no class employee with ID 3. Okay, so let me check because it's already there. So okay, so this is my get information. So let me check what are the information I have here. Correct. So if I just employ, okay, so whenever it will actually refresh, means this publish our, so this will erase from our h2 database. So let's try to again create one more. So one is Shine Day and there is Kalyan Day as well. So with this 75,000 data, and suppose it will creating with this ID. So now I have two information, one is Shine Day and one is Kalyan Day. Okay, and here I just have this Shande and just make it as GCP and just make it as a 85,000. Okay, so this will now creating this particular thing. And now if you want to delete based on this ID, if I just run it, so employee ID with ID3 is deleted successfully. So now if I just want to check what are the values are there, so there is only Kalyan there. So this entire things is basically, if you check in the console itself, so this entire operation will there, you can see that what are the basically DB is basically DB statement is running from your backend. It can also be shown here. So that's all for this video. So hope you will understand these things. If you have any questions, please mention those in my comment section, and please like my channel, share it, and definitely subscribe it. We will see you in the next video that will integrate this same employee microservice or same employee Spring Boot application with our MySQL database. Thanks for watching.